Hi, Diane. How are you doing? I'm glad to have you with me.
Fine, thank you.
Diane owns several businesses here in the CSRA in North Augusta, but she has a dynamic story of surviving spouse abuse. Why don't you start off by telling us, you said you were married for 17 years to this man, right?
Yes, I was, and I had no idea when we got married, and he convinced me that he was the most wonderful man in the world, that I would ever face abuse. And it's like, well, the other day I opened an email in my computer, and I use my computer a lot in my business, and a virus was attached to an email, and I didn't know it, and it was like I clicked on it, and suddenly it took over my address book and began to mail over 70 emails to everyone that I knew. It began to record my keystrokes, and it happened so fast, and as it slowly destroyed a lot of information that I collected over a long period of time, it was like abuse. It reminded me of the way abuse is, because the first time it hits you, it takes you by surprise, and you're wondering, this isn't a part of my life. What can I do? And I began to ignore it and think, well, he apologized so profusely. I thought, well, it'll never happen again, and I'll just go on. And it happened again and again. And each time it happens, it steals a little bit more of you until you become someone that you're not, and you begin to hide parts of yourself, and you don't even know who you are. And I became like a robot that couldn't feel. I really felt like I couldn't feel. I was very successful in my career, and just won a trip for my entire district to Mexico, and just worked and did all the things that I needed to do to continue the facade of perfection that I felt.
You said that you worked out a lot.
Yes, and I was a marathon runner. I ran 20 miles a week, and that was a way that I really dealt with the stress I was going through.
Well, let me ask you this question, and this is one question, and we'll get the audience to ask questions a little bit later on in the show. But one question that people ask a lot is, why didn't you leave? And your case was similar to mine in that your husband had a position in your church.
Yes, he did.
And so you didn't leave right away because what were you thinking?
Well, I was thinking, what will the people in the church think? What will my Sunday school class, the girls that I teach, what will they think?
What about your family? Did it ever cross your mind about your parents? What was your family going to think, or was that a concern for you?
Yes, it was. I was afraid that they would really begin to hate him, and I knew my children needed their father, and now I see that they were so damaged by him that leaving would have caused a lot less damage.
One of the things that you and I have talked about, and we've talked about this in the past, is that that's one of the things that a lot of women say to us when we've gone around speaking and whatnot. You do public speaking as
yes.
well. That, well, I want to have an intact home, especially if you were from a home where there's been divorce in your family. My family has his own share of dysfunction, and I didn't want to ever go through a divorce. I mean, I wanted to get married, have my children, have the kids grow up, and we have this plan for them going to college and all the things that you do. But while you're trying to hold on to that dream, it's really not a dream at all. In fact, you and I talked about the Department of Justice has reported that 80% of the young men in prison for murder have murdered someone that they saw abuse their mother.
Yes.
So it's not worth it. Actually, in my opinion, it's a form of child abuse when you stay there thinking, my kids need a father.
It is, and my sons will not speak to their father now, and just the very memory of them, it creates such pain in their lives. It's hard for them.
I think the worst thing that we can do is leave a legacy for our children that they see us as women that are afraid to be people. And like you said, you stop being yourself, because you're spending all your time trying to avoid, walking on eggshells, nothing
yes.
to walk in there, trying to avoid. Every time you have a family function, they do something that's disruptive. You know you're not going to have a good time. You're not going to have a good Christmas. I see some of you nodding your heads. You've either experienced it or you know someone who've experienced it. So we're going to take a break in just a minute. I hate to leave in such a middle of such a good story, but when we come back, we're going to have some leaders from some of the domestic violence intervention centers who's going to help us answer some of these hard questions, and then we're going to take questions from the audience.
Welcome back. To those of you just joining us, we've been talking to Diane Brady about her abusive marriage, and I know that she was very successful with her job. You had mentioned that, but I don't think everybody realized what social status you were in. You were actually in the six-figure level, weren't you?
That's right. Yes.
I know from reading Marilyn's book that a lot of abusers are socially or emotionally impaired. Would you say that was true with your husband?
Yes, it was, because as I got more and more successful, the abuse escalated and began to occur more frequently. And it was, he was religious and I was religious, but God began to show me that he wanted more. He wanted a relationship with me that had nothing to do with a religion or church, but had everything to do with him and his word. And the more I got into it, the more free I became, until I had the courage to call 911 the next time it happened. And when it did, I was like on autopilot. It was like I was driven, and I didn't want to stop myself, but even fear didn't stop me. And I knew that I just had to bite the bullet and go forward. And God began to strip things off of me that I had compensated for in that part of myself that I had lost. And I began to know who I was. And God began to show me that he loved me for who I was, not for being perfect or being this automaton that I had become to hide my emotions and what was going on in my personal life. And it was indeed freedom. And it was like an open door, and I walked through it. And the more that I walked, the more God showed me and freed me.
You can tell you have so much joy now.
Thank
I'm
you.
glad you took the courage to leave.
Thank you.
And I think we have some special guests, too.
I want you to put your hands together and help us welcome Pam Witter. She's with the Domestic Violence Intervention Center. How you doing? And we're going to hand you. You know, Diane was sharing that it doesn't matter what your socioeconomic level is, and I'm sure that you, in your profession and working with the Domestic Violence Intervention Center, you get to see women from all walks of life, and even if they're successful or they're not, it doesn't seem to matter. Abuse seems to have no limitations.
Marilyn, I think that is probably the most significant thing for anyone to realize, is that domestic violence crosses all socioeconomic, religious, gender boundaries. It's one of the few crimes in this nation that really has no limits. Age, culture, it is completely across the board. We see a lot of times that the stereotype is a lower socioeconomic person, and that is not true. It is across the board with everyone.
Well, you know, the reason why I ended up writing my book, If He Doesn't Deliver, was because, and that has a dual meaning. One of the things that happened, I was a nurse, and during the time that I was going through my situation, the shelters were not as prevalent as they are now. I am amazed at how easy it is today for women to be able to pick up a phone and call a shelter and get immediate help. When this happened to me, it was over almost 25 years ago, almost, and the shelters were not as prevalent then as they are now. The advocates for women were not out there as bold. We were going through the women's lib movement, but not women's protection very much. And I found out when I would go to different conferences and stuff as a nurse that many times, especially when we were having domestic violence type of educational things, I began to meet different directors and people that have positions like yours with the shelters that were popping up that said that the religious population was the hardest for them to intervene for, because they kept going back and kept going back and kept going back to their abuser. Have you found that to be the case?
That is the case, and you have to look at the structure and the culture of our country and the history and the precedent that has been set in the court system. It wasn't until the 70s where women were actually able to come out and get support for this. We do find in a religious structure, sometimes we've got a woman that is trying to leave and is really stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Right.
Because there are people that are helping her get out of the situation, and there are also people making her feel guilty about getting out of it and leaving it and trying to keep it together.
Well, you know, I have a good story about that. I worked with a nurse about 15 years ago, 10 or 15 years ago, And that was a situation that she had managed to get the courage to, and I don't think it takes courage to leave an abuser. I'm going to be honest with you. I have a really different idea, even though I survived and got out and escaped with my life. I don't think it takes courage. I think it takes common sense. Anybody that, a dog won't stay around and let you just kick and beat on him. And women, I think, have more brain cells than animals, and I don't think it takes a lot of courage. It takes common sense to say, I didn't sign up for this, But what happened in this case is this nurse that I worked with, her daughter had gotten what she felt was the courage to leave this guy, and every day people from her church and her friends and her family, because he made good money, kept calling her, telling her, oh, you're making a mistake. If you have really forgiven him, you'll take him back. And he would call her, I thought you said that you were religious. You should at least meet with me, and we need to talk. And he kept doing that to the point that one day she came to work and said, I haven't been able to reach my daughter. I've been calling her and haven't been able to reach her other kids, and that's unusual. This went on day after day until finally, after a couple of days, people started getting worried. When she was finally found a month or so later, it was after one of those phone calls, and she had agreed to meet with him and see him because they were making her feel guilty, and he just proceeded to shoot her, shot her to death, stuffed her in the trunk of the car, and took the car out and hid it. He's now serving a life sentence, but that wouldn't have ever happened if she'd stayed away.
Mm-hmm. And it is... We can say that it's common sense, and some of us can look at it and say, why don't women leave? We typically find that the one trigger that will cause women to finally take that step to leave is their children. Something will happen to one of their children, or a threat will be to one of their children. It will cause them to leave. The number one reason why women stay or go back is typically financial.
Oh, you know what? I was talking to a college professor, and she had several businesses. She had huge diamond rings on her hand. She had no children. And she actually said to me one day, I don't have the courage that you had to leave your situation. And when I left, my children and I, it was in the winter, my children and I were homeless for 3 months. We actually slept in my car. And here this lady had unlimited resources. And she said she didn't have the courage to leave because of the money that he was spending on her. And I asked her point blank, are those trinkets more important than your life? Because it can happen. It can happen. Mm-hmm. And most women think, oh, he'll never kill me. What if he hits you and you fall and accidentally hit your head? When it's over, it's over.